She walked alone on an autumn afternoon, along a path she knew by heart. And somewhere between the water and the trees, between one breath and the next, Mary Pinchot Meyer ceased to exist. But this isn't just another unsolved case. This is a story about power, secrets, and the dangerous intersection of art and espionage in the shadow of Camelot. If stories like this keep you awake at night, if you find yourself drawn to the questions history refuses to answer, then subscribe to the Midnight File. Because tonight, we're opening a dossier that some very powerful people once hoped would stay closed forever. This is a true story. October 12th, 1964. Georgetown, Washington, D.C. The leaves were turning, painting the towpath along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal in shades of amber and rust. It was the kind of afternoon that makes you believe in fresh starts, in quiet redemptions. The air carried that particular October crispness, cool enough to remind you that winter was coming, warm enough in the sunlight to make you forget. Mary Pinchot Meyer, 43 years old, had just finished a painting in her studio. She cleaned her brushes methodically, the way artists do, with the kind of attention that comes from years of practice. Each bristle straightened, each color rinsed away, leaving only clean water in the jar. She stepped outside into the golden afternoon light and made a decision that countless people make every day without consequence. She decided to take a walk. The towpath was her sanctuary, a narrow strip of earth running alongside the canal, flanked by water on one side and a gentle slope on the other. Trees arched overhead, oaks and maples and sycamores, filtering the October sunlight into golden fragments that danced across the ground as the wind moved through the branches. The canal itself was calm, reflecting the sky like dark glass. She walked here often, sometimes to think, sometimes to escape, sometimes simply to move through the world as herself rather than as someone's daughter, someone's ex-wife, someone's former lover. On this particular afternoon, she needed the solitude. She needed the rhythm of her own footsteps, the whisper of wind through dying leaves, the sense of being alone with her thoughts in a world that was constantly trying to define her by her relationships to powerful men. She wore casual clothes, the kind of outfit that suggested she hadn't planned to be gone long. A light jacket, comfortable shoes for walking. No purse, no identification that would immediately tell police who she was. Just a woman out for a walk on a beautiful afternoon in Georgetown, one of Washington's most elegant neighborhoods, a place where people were supposed to be safe. But Mary Meyer wasn't alone on the towpath that day. At approximately 12:45 in the afternoon, a mechanic named Henry Wiggins was working on a car near the canal. He was a responsible man, the kind who took his work seriously, who paid attention to details. He was focused on an engine, hands deep in machinery, oil on his fingers, when he heard something that made his blood freeze. A woman's voice, desperate and terrified, cutting through the autumn stillness like a blade. "Someone help me. Someone help me." The words were sharp with panic, with the knowledge that something irreversible was happening. There was no mistaking the tone. This wasn't a call for minor assistance. This was a plea from someone who knew they were in mortal danger. Then came the shots, 2 of them. Sharp cracks that echoed across the water and through the trees, unmistakable in their violence, their finality. Wiggins ran. He abandoned his tools, his work, everything, and he ran toward the sound. He ran to a low stone wall that overlooked the towpath below, and what he saw in that moment would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman lay on the ground, still, her body positioned in that particular way that suggests life has left it. A man stood over her, not kneeling, not checking for signs of life, just standing. And in the space between them hung the weight of something terrible and final. The man was black, Wiggins would later tell police. Medium height, stocky build, maybe 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing around 185 pounds. And as Wiggins watched, frozen at the wall above, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees with the calm deliberation of someone who knew exactly where he was going, not running, not panicking, just walking, as if he'd completed a task and was moving on to whatever came next. Wiggins shouted. He tried to get down to the towpath, tried to help, tried to do something, anything, but by the time he reached the woman, It was already too late. She lay on the path. 2 wounds clearly visible. Blood pooled beneath her head, darkening the earth. Her eyes were open but unseeing. Mary Pinchot Meyer would never paint again. She would never walk that towpath again. She would never question another official story or challenge another comfortable lie. 2 bullets had ended her life, one to the left temple, one to her back. Both fired at point-blank range. Both instantly fatal. The medical examiner would later note the dark halos on the skin around the entry wounds, the telltale signature of a weapon pressed close against flesh. These weren't wild shots fired from a distance. These weren't the panicked actions of someone committing their first act of violence. This was precision. This was control. This was someone who knew exactly where to aim, and exactly what would happen when they pulled the trigger. The examiner, a man who'd seen countless bodies, countless wounds, couldn't help but note in his report that the shot placement suggested someone with training, someone who understood human anatomy, someone who knew how to end a life efficiently. This wasn't random violence. This was execution. But to understand why Mary Meyer's passing matters, why it still matters 6 decades later, why we're still talking about it, why investigators and researchers and conspiracy theorists and historians still can't let it go, we need to understand who she was. Because Mary wasn't just another victim. She was a woman who moved through the highest corridors of American power, who knew secrets that powerful men would rather keep buried, who loved a president and questioned an agency, and refused to accept the lies she was being told. She was someone who mattered. And that makes her ending either a tragic coincidence or something much darker. Let me take you back. Back to October 14th, 1920, when Mary Pinchot entered a world of privilege and influence that most people can scarcely imagine. She was born into American aristocracy, not the kind that comes from Hollywood or Wall Street, but the older, quieter kind that comes from land and legacy and names that appear in history books. The kind of aristocracy where your family doesn't just have money, they have roots. They have connections going back centuries. They have the kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself because everyone already knows it's there. Her family descended from French Huguenots who had fled religious persecution in the 17th century, crossing the Atlantic to build new lives in a new world. They'd succeeded beyond measure, transforming themselves from refugees into aristocrats within a few generations. They built their fortune in lumber and wallpaper manufacturing, transforming raw materials into wealth, into power, into access. But it wasn't just about money. The Pinchot family believed in public service, in using their privilege for the greater good, in the idea that those who have been given much have a responsibility to give back. Her uncle was Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt's legendary conservationist, the first head of the United States Forest Service, later governor of Pennsylvania. Gifford Pinchot was a man who believed that America's natural resources belonged to all Americans, not just to the wealthy few who could buy up the land. He fought against private monopolies, championed sustainable forestry practices, and helped establish the national park system. The Pinchot name didn't just open doors, it commanded respect, it carried weight, it meant something in the circles where decisions were made and history was shaped. Mary grew up on Gray Towers, the family's 300-acre estate in Milford, Pennsylvania. Rolling hills covered in forests, carefully maintained gardens, and at the heart of it all, a stone mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from a European countryside. She attended Brearley School in New York, then Vassar College, where she was selected for the prestigious daisy chain ceremony in her senior year, an honor reserved for the most outstanding students. After graduation in 1942, Mary moved to New York to pursue journalism. But she was also drawn to art. She took classes at the Art Students League, learning to translate emotion into brushstrokes. She was brilliant, everyone agreed on that. But she was also something more dangerous. She was curious, she asked questions, she challenged assumptions. And she refused to accept simple answers to complex problems. In a world that preferred women to be decorative and agreeable, Mary Pinchot was neither. In 1945, Mary married Cord Meyer, a decorated war hero who'd lost an eye fighting in the Pacific. He was handsome, idealistic, passionate about creating a better world through the United Nations and international cooperation. They seemed perfect together, two intelligent, privileged people committed to making the world more peaceful. They had 3 sons together, but their 9-year-old son, Michael, was tragically struck and lost in a car accident in December 1956. Grief revealed that they were no longer the same people who'd fallen in love. Cord, meanwhile, had joined the Central Intelligence Agency, becoming a senior official in covert operations. The idealist who'd championed world peace was now working for an organization that specialized in regime changes and covert interventions. Mary hated it. She was a lifelong pacifist who believed covert operations were fundamentally at odds with democratic values. They would argue late into the night about Guatemala, Iran, countries where the agency was toppling governments. They divorced in 1958. Mary moved into Georgetown and threw herself into her art. She established herself as a serious contributor to the Washington Color School movement, abstract expressionists pushing boundaries. She created large-scale paintings, vibrant geometric works that demanded attention. Her work appeared in prestigious exhibitions, including the Pan American Union's traveling show, 9 Contemporary Painters. She was no longer just a Pinchot, no longer just someone's ex-wife. She was Mary Meyer, artist. But art wasn't her only passion. She experimented with marijuana and LSD, not recreationally, but as tools for exploring consciousness, for accessing states that might reveal deeper truths. In the early 1960s, this made her part of an influential group who believed psychedelics might help humanity evolve beyond Cold War thinking. And then there was Jack Kennedy. If you're finding this story as compelling as I am, if you're starting to understand why this case has fascinated researchers for decades, take a moment and hit that like button. It helps more people discover stories that deserve to be told, and believe me, we're only beginning to scratch the surface of this mystery. Mary had first met John F. Kennedy when they were teenagers, at a dance at Choate. Kennedy had cut in on her date, bold, confident, charming even then. They'd gone their separate ways, but in the early 1960s, after Kennedy became president, something reignited between them. The affair began sometime around 1962. Mary's name started appearing in White House visitor logs, always when Jackie Kennedy was away. According to White House counsel Meyer Feldman, Mary was almost a part of the furniture. Because this wasn't like Kennedy's other affairs, and there were many others, we know that now. The historical record is clear. Kennedy was compulsively unfaithful, constantly seeking new conquests, treating women as interchangeable in a way that was typical of powerful men of his generation, but is still deeply troubling to contemplate. But Mary was different. She wasn't impressed by his power. She'd grown up around powerful people. She wasn't intimidated by his intelligence. She was his intellectual equal, maybe his superior in some ways, and she wasn't afraid to tell him when she thought he was wrong. Mary challenged Kennedy intellectually. She introduced him to ideas, to perspectives, to ways of thinking about the world that were foreign to a man raised in the competitive, masculine world of Boston Irish politics. She talked to him about consciousness expansion, about the possibility that human beings were operating far below their potential, about Eastern philosophy and Western existentialism and the intersection of art and politics. She encouraged him to question the assumptions of the Cold War, to imagine alternatives to mutually assured destruction, to think about peace not as the absence of war, but as the presence of something better. And according to some accounts that are impossible to verify but also impossible to completely dismiss, she gave him LSD. Timothy Leary, the Harvard psychologist who became famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, for his psychedelic research, later claimed that Mary visited him in April of 1962 at his office in Cambridge. She wanted to learn how to conduct an LSD session, she told him. She knew a very important man who was impressed by her experiences with the substance and wanted to try it himself. Leary never named the man, but the implication was clear. Who else could Mary have been referring to? Who else would have fit that description? Did Mary Pinchot Meyer give LSD to the President of the United States? Did John F. Kennedy, the leader of the free world, the man with his finger on the nuclear button, experience a psychedelic journey in the White House? We'll never know for certain. Leary's credibility is questionable. He had reasons to exaggerate his own importance, to claim connections to powerful people. to make himself seem more influential than he was. But it's also true that Mary was deeply involved in the psychedelic research community, that she had access to LSD, that she believed in its potential to transform consciousness, and that she had the kind of relationship with Kennedy where she could propose something like that and be taken seriously rather than dismissed. What we do know is that something changed in Kennedy during those years, during the period when he and Mary were involved. The hawk who'd brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 began talking about peace. The president who'd been willing to risk everything to prevent Soviet missiles in Cuba began pursuing détente. The Cold Warrior started sounding like a pacifist. In June of 1963, Kennedy delivered a commencement address at American University that shocked the Pentagon and State Department. He called for an end to the Cold War, for cooperation with the Soviet Union, for recognizing our common humanity instead of fixating on our differences. He said that peace need not be impracticable, that war need not be inevitable. He spoke about the need to examine our own attitudes, to move beyond the US versus them mentality that had dominated American foreign policy since World War II. He talked about the Soviet people with sympathy and respect, acknowledging their suffering during the war, their legitimate security concerns, their desire for peace. The speech was remarkable. It represented a fundamental shift in how the president was thinking about America's role in the world, and it terrified the national security establishment. The military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower had warned about just 2 years earlier was deeply invested in the Cold War. Defense contractors needed the threat of Soviet aggression to justify enormous budgets. Military leaders needed the specter of communist expansion to maintain their power and prestige. Intelligence agencies needed the Cold War to justify covert operations around the world. And here was Kennedy, suggesting that maybe peace was possible. Maybe we could coexist with the Soviets. Maybe we could reduce nuclear stockpiles, sign test ban treaties, move toward a world where mutually assured destruction wasn't the only thing preventing World War III. Some historians dismiss the idea that Mary influenced this transformation. They point to other factors, the trauma of the missile crisis, political calculations about how to win re-election, evolving strategic thinking influenced by advisors. But those who knew them both insist there was something deeper at play. Kennedy's close friends noted that he talked about Mary differently than he talked about other women. He respected her. He valued her opinion. He seemed to genuinely care what she thought, not just about him, but about the world, about his presidency, about the choices he was making. Mary had a way of making people question their certainties, of challenging the assumptions they'd never thought to question. And Kennedy, for all his flaws, and they were many and significant, was capable of growth. He was intelligent enough to recognize when his thinking was being expanded, sophisticated enough to incorporate new ideas into his worldview. The affair continued until November 22nd, 1963. You know what happened that day. Everyone knows. Kennedy was in Dallas, riding in an open car through Dealey Plaza, waving to crowds, when shots rang out. The president was struck, fatally wounded, and died at Parkland Memorial Hospital. The news spread across the country in waves of shock and disbelief. Television broadcasts were interrupted. Offices closed. People gathered around radios and televisions trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how their president could be gone. Mary was devastated. According to her sister Toni, Mary wept for days. But devastation for Mary didn't mean withdrawal. It meant questions. It meant refusing to accept the official story, the neat narrative that was being constructed even before Kennedy's body was cold. Almost immediately, the official line was that Lee Harvey Oswald, a troubled ex-Marine with communist sympathies, had acted alone. There was no conspiracy, no other gunman, no involvement by any organizations, domestic or foreign. Just one man with a rifle changing history. Mary didn't believe it. She told friends she was convinced the CIA had been involved. Not as speculation, not as wild conspiracy theorizing, but as a conclusion based on what she knew, what she'd observed, what she'd learned during her years married to a senior CIA official and her years involved with the president. And given her intimate knowledge of the agency through Cord, given her access to the kinds of conversations that happened in the White House when Jackie was away, Given what she understood about the tensions between Kennedy and the intelligence community, her suspicions carried weight. This wasn't someone on the outside looking in, making guesses based on newspaper reports. This was someone who'd had access to both sides of the conflict, who understood how the CIA operated, who knew what Kennedy had been trying to do and who'd been opposing him. Now we need to talk about the Warren Commission. After Kennedy's passing, President Lyndon Johnson established a commission to investigate the circumstances and answer the questions that were consuming the nation. Chief Justice Earl Warren led it, and the commission included some of the most respected figures in American public life: senators, congressmen, former CIA Director Allen Dulles. They spent 10 months conducting interviews, examining evidence, reviewing testimony from hundreds of witnesses. On September 27, 1964, less than a year after Kennedy died, they released their findings. The Warren Commission report was massive, running to hundreds of pages, with volumes of supporting documentation. But their conclusion was simple, definitive, and controversial. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. There was no conspiracy, no second gunman on the grassy knoll, no involvement by the Soviet Union or Cuba or any foreign power. No involvement by the FBI or CIA or any domestic intelligence agency. Just one troubled man with a rifle and a twisted sense of destiny. The report was supposed to settle the questions, to provide closure, to allow the nation to move forward. Instead, it raised more questions than it answered. How could Oswald, a mediocre marksman, fire 3 shots with such accuracy in such a short time? Why were there witness reports of shots coming from different directions? How did Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner with mob connections, managed to get close enough to Oswald to eliminate him just 2 days after Kennedy was taken, conveniently silencing the one person who could have answered definitively whether he'd acted alone? Mary didn't believe the Warren Commission. She told friends she was convinced the CIA had been involved. She started asking questions, making phone calls, talking to people who might know something, who might have seen something, who might be willing to admit that the official story didn't add up. She wasn't writing a book or planning to go public, at least not that anyone knows of. But she was investigating. She was refusing to accept the narrative she was being given. And then, less than 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report was released, Mary Pinchot Meyer went for a walk along the towpath. If you need to pause here, to take a breath, I understand. This is where the story shifts, where tragedy becomes something darker and more disturbing. But stay with me, because what happened next, what happened in the hours and days after Mary's passing, is where this case transforms from an unsolved crime into one of the most controversial mysteries in American history. And if you're not already subscribed to the Midnight File, now would be a good time. Hit that subscribe button, because we bring you stories like this every week, stories that refuse to be forgotten, that demand to be examined, that reveal the shadows behind the official histories, stories about the cases that powerful people hoped would stay buried. 45 minutes after Henry Wiggins heard those shots, after he saw that figure standing over Mary's body, after he'd tried desperately to help and realized it was too late, police arrested a man. His name was Ray Crump, Jr., a 25-year-old day laborer who lived in Washington, D.C. He was black, poor, uneducated, the kind of person who society has always found it easy to blame, easy to prosecute, easy to forget. They found him near the crime scene, about half a mile from where Mary's body lay. He was wet, his clothes soaked through, water dripping from his hair. There was a cut on his hand, a small wound that was bleeding. When police approached him, he looked confused, disoriented, like a man who'd just been through something traumatic but didn't fully understand what was happening to him. When they asked what he was doing there, Ray Crump told them a simple story. He'd been fishing in the Potomac River. He'd been trying to retrieve his fishing pole when he'd lost his balance and fallen into the water. That's why his clothes were wet. That's why he looked the way he did. He hadn't heard any shots. He didn't know anything about anyone being hurt. He'd just been fishing alone, trying to catch something to take home to his family. The police didn't believe him. Henry Wiggins had described seeing a black man standing over the body. Ray Crump was black. To them, the case was essentially closed. They arrested him on the spot, charged him with first-degree homicide, and transported him to jail where he would spend the next 8 months awaiting trial. But here's where things get interesting, Because when you actually examine the evidence, when you look beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions and biases, and the rush to close the case quickly, the case against Ray Crump starts to fall apart under even minimal scrutiny. First, the physical description. This is critical. Henry Wiggins told police he'd seen a man who stood approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighed around 185 pounds. He was certain about this. He'd gotten a clear look at the man, close enough to provide specific details. But Ray Crump was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 135 pounds. That's a difference of 5 inches and 50 pounds. That's not a minor discrepancy. That's not something you can attribute to poor lighting or momentary observation. You cannot mistake a man who's 5'3" for a man who's 5'8". The difference is too substantial, and yet, the police seemed untroubled by this contradiction. They had a black man near the scene, and that was apparently enough. Second, the forensic evidence, or rather, the complete and total absence of it. Mary Meyer bled extensively from her head wound. The bullet that entered her temple caused massive trauma, and blood pooled on the towpath, soaked into the earth, marked the place where she'd fallen. Her killer, standing over her, firing at point-blank range, would have been covered in blood. There's no way around this. The physics of gunshot wounds, especially to the head, especially at close range, means that blood sprays, spatters, gets on everything nearby. Yet when police examined Ray Crump's clothing, his hands, his body, they found nothing. Not a trace of Mary's blood. Not a single drop. His clothes were wet from the river, but they weren't stained with blood. His hands were clean. There was nothing on him that connected him physically to the crime scene or to Mary Meyer. The FBI crime report, which wasn't disclosed to the defense during trial, but was later published by researcher Peter Janney in his book Mary's Mosaic, confirmed this in stark language. No forensic evidence whatsoever linked Ray Crump to the victim or the scene. None. Zero. The kind of categorical absence of evidence that should have immediately raised questions about whether police had arrested the wrong person. Third, the weapon. The weapon that fired those 2 fatal shots was never found. Police searched the canal, brought in divers who spent days dragging the river bottom. They combed through the woods, examined the area around the towpath with meticulous attention. Nothing. The weapon had vanished completely. Now, think about the timeline. Ray Crump was found about half a mile from the crime scene, 45 minutes after the shots were fired. If he'd fired those shots, if he'd stood over Mary's body and then walked away, where did the weapon go? How did he dispose of it so completely that trained investigators with unlimited resources couldn't locate it? Did he throw it in the river? The divers would have found it. Did he hide it in the woods? The search teams would have located it. Did he give it to someone else? Who and when, and where's the evidence of that? The prosecution's theory required Ray Crump to have committed this act, disposed of the weapon in a way that left no trace, and cleaned all of Mary's blood off himself, all while leaving witnesses alive who could identify him and place him at the scene. It required him to be simultaneously sloppy enough to be caught immediately, and sophisticated enough to eliminate all physical evidence connecting him to the crime. It doesn't make sense. It never made sense. And fourth, perhaps most troubling, there was another witness. Army Lieutenant William L. Mitchell testified that he'd been jogging on the towpath the day before Mary was taken. He'd seen a black man following a white woman who he believed in retrospect was Mary Meyer. The man had seemed suspicious to Mitchell, out of place somehow, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. The prosecution wanted Mitchell's testimony to establish premeditation, to suggest that someone had been stalking Mary. But when the defense attorney asked Mitchell to identify the man he'd seen, to confirm that it was Ray Crump, Mitchell couldn't do it. He looked at Crump, he studied him, and then he said, under oath, that he couldn't say with certainty that Crump was the man he'd seen following Mary. The witness the prosecution called to strengthen their case ended up introducing reasonable doubt instead. The prosecution presented 27 witnesses. They introduced more than 50 pieces of circumstantial evidence. They built their case with the confidence of people who believed justice was on their side, who believed they'd caught the right man, who believed that securing a conviction was just a matter of presenting the facts to a jury who would naturally reach the correct conclusion. And then they met Dovey Johnson Roundtree. Dovie Roundtree was a legend in Washington legal circles, long before she took Ray Crump's case, though her legend has only grown in the decades since. She was a black woman practicing law at a time when that meant fighting for respect in every courtroom, from every judge, from every jury. She'd been one of the first African-American women to serve in the Marine Corps, a Montford Point Marine who'd experienced discrimination and prejudice from her own country, even as she served it. She'd fought for civil rights before the civil rights movement had a name, had challenged segregation in interstate travel, had represented clients who others wouldn't touch because the cases were too difficult or too controversial or too likely to end in defeat. When Ray Crump's family asked her to defend him, she looked at the evidence and saw not guilt, but reasonable doubt. She saw a case built on assumptions rather than facts, on racial prejudice rather than forensic evidence, on the need to close a high-profile case quickly rather than on genuine investigation. She was brilliant, she was fearless, and she was absolutely determined that Ray Crump would get the defense he deserved. Roundtree presented just 3 witnesses in Crump's defense, just 1 exhibit. But what she really presented was a systematic destruction of everything the prosecution claimed. She cross-examined every witness with surgical precision, exposing inconsistencies, highlighting contradictions, planting seeds of doubt. She focused on the physical description discrepancy. She made the jury look at Ray Crump, really look at him, and then made them imagine trying to mistake him for a man 5 inches taller and 50 pounds heavier. She highlighted the complete absence of forensic evidence, no blood, no weapon, no physical connection of any kind between Crump and the victim. She made the jury see what investigators had refused to see, that finding someone near a crime scene doesn't mean they committed the crime, that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, and that proof means more than circumstantial evidence that doesn't hold up under scrutiny. After 11 hours of deliberation, on July 29, 1965, the jury returned their verdict, not guilty. Ray Crump walked free. The courtroom erupted. Some people were shocked. Others were elated. The prosecution was stunned. They'd been so certain, so confident in their case. But 12 citizens had looked at the evidence and decided that reasonable doubt existed, that the prosecution hadn't met its burden, that Ray Crump deserved to go home. And officially, from that day to this, Mary Pinchot Meyer's case remains unsolved. No one has ever been convicted of her ending. No one has ever been held accountable. The file sits in archives, gathering dust, a cold case that gets colder with every passing year. But here's where the story becomes something else entirely. Because while the trial was about Ray Crump, while the courtroom drama focused on whether one man was guilty or innocent, the real mystery of Mary Meyer's fate isn't about who was or wasn't convicted. It's about what happened in the hours and days after she was taken. It's about the diary. It's about who knew what and when they knew it. It's about the CIA's immediate involvement in a case that should have been purely a matter for local police. It's about evidence destroyed and questions never asked, and investigations that stopped short of where they should have gone. I need you to understand the timeline here, because the timeline is everything. The timeline is where the official story starts to crack, where the coincidences pile up so high that you have to decide whether you believe in coincidences of this magnitude or whether something else was happening. Mary Meyer was shot on the towpath at approximately 12:45 p.m. on October 12, 1964. Her body was discovered shortly afterward by Henry Wiggins and others who responded to the sound of shots. Police arrived on scene within minutes. They secured the area, began interviewing witnesses, started the machinery of investigation. But Mary was carrying no identification. She'd gone for a walk, not expecting to need her purse or wallet or any of the documents that would immediately tell police who she was. So in those first hours, investigators had a victim, a witness, a suspect, but no name for the woman lying in the morgue. They had a white woman, early 40s, well-dressed, clearly from money based on her clothes and appearance, but they didn't know who she was. Not yet. Except someone did know. Someone knew almost immediately. Someone knew before the police had identified the body, before Mary's family had been officially notified, before her name appeared in any police report. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, less than 2 hours after the shots were fired, hours before Mary's identity became public, Before anyone outside a small circle of investigators knew who she was, the phone rang at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The call went to Cord Meyer, Mary's ex-husband, who was now a senior official in the agency's Covert Operations Division. The caller informed him that Mary had been taken. She'd been shot, she was gone. And simultaneously, the same information was shared with James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence chief, one of the most powerful and mysterious figures in American intelligence. Let that sink in for a moment. Really, let it sink in. The CIA knew Mary Meyer was gone before the police had even identified her body, before anyone had gone through official channels to notify her next of kin, before the medical examiner had begun his work, before reporters had gotten wind of the story. How did they know? Who called Cord Meyer at 2:30 in the afternoon with information that shouldn't have been available to anyone outside the immediate investigation? How did that information reach the highest levels of the CIA within 2 hours of Mary's passing? The official explanation, such as it exists, is that someone, perhaps a police officer, perhaps someone at the scene, recognized Mary and made an unofficial call to the CIA out of courtesy, knowing her connection to Cord Meyer. But that explanation raises more questions than it answers. If someone recognized her, why wasn't her identity entered into official records immediately? Why did the police continue treating her as an unidentified victim for hours after the CIA already knew who she was? And why would a police officer's first instinct be to call the CIA rather than following proper notification procedures through official channels? But it gets worse, much worse, because knowing that Mary was gone wasn't enough. The CIA needed something else. They needed her diary. That evening, the same evening Mary was taken, while her body still lay in the morgue, while police were still processing the crime scene and interviewing witnesses, James Jesus Angleton went to Mary's Georgetown art studio. He didn't go alone. He brought his wife, Cicely. And he brought tools, lock-picking tools, because Mary's studio was locked, and Angleton intended to get inside whether he had legal authority to do so or not. James Angleton wasn't just any CIA official, he was the head of counterintelligence, the man responsible for protecting the agency from foreign espionage, for rooting out double agents, for maintaining the CIA's secrets. He was legendary within the intelligence community, brilliant, paranoid, utterly committed to the agency's mission. He believed in conspiracies because he'd helped create them. He believed people were always lying because he spent his days swimming in an ocean of lies and deception and covert operations where nothing was what it seemed. And on the evening of October 12, 1964, he was breaking into a deceased woman's art studio, searching for her personal diary. Ben Bradley, who would later become the managing editor of the Washington Post, who would oversee the paper's coverage of Watergate and become one of the most respected journalists in America, was Mary's brother-in-law. He was married to Mary's sister, Toni Bradley. When Ben and Toni heard about Mary's passing, they rushed to her studio, thinking about her artwork, her personal effects, the practical matters that need attending to when someone is suddenly gone. When they arrived, they found Angleton already there. He was at the door, working on the lock with tools, determined to get inside. The scene was surreal. A top CIA official caught red-handed breaking into a crime victim's studio on the day she was taken, and he wasn't even trying to hide what he was doing. He looked at the Bradleys and essentially admitted he was searching for Mary's diary. He needed to secure it, for security reasons, for the protection of national interests. Think about what that means. Think about the implications. A woman is violently taken on a Georgetown towpath. Within hours, before her body is even cold, before her family has had time to process the shock and grief, the head of CIA counterintelligence is breaking into her private studio to confiscate her personal writings, not asking permission, not going through legal channels, not waiting for any kind of official authorization, just taking matters into his own hands because he believed he had the authority, the right, the necessity to seize whatever Mary had written. What was in that diary? What could possibly be so important that it required immediate action by one of the most senior officials in American intelligence? What secrets, what information, what observations had Mary recorded that made her private thoughts a matter of national security? According to Ben Bradley's 1995 autobiography, A Good Life, the diary detailed Mary's affair with President Kennedy. It contained intimate details, personal reflections, observations about the president and the pressures he faced, the conversations they'd had, the relationship they'd shared. Bradley claimed that after finding the diary, whether he found it that night or later, accounts vary, he and Tony decided it was a private document that shouldn't be made public. They were protecting Mary's privacy, protecting Kennedy's memory, protecting Jackie Kennedy from further pain, so they gave it to Angleton, trusting him to handle it appropriately. Angleton claimed he destroyed it. He said he took it to CIA headquarters and burned it, eliminating it from history, ensuring that Mary's private thoughts would never be exploited or misused. The diary was gone, he said. It no longer existed. There was nothing to investigate, nothing to subpoena, nothing that could shed light on Mary's state of mind or the events leading up to her passing. But decades later, Tony Bradley told a different story. She said she'd retrieved the diary from Angleton, or maybe she'd never given it to him in the first place. The accounts are contradictory. She said she'd burned it herself in the presence of artist Anne Truitt, a close friend of Mary's. She'd watched it burn, watched Mary's words turn to ash, ensuring that no one could ever use those private thoughts against her memory or against the people Mary had loved. Two different stories, two different versions of what happened to potentially crucial evidence. And both versions result in the same outcome. The diary is gone, destroyed, unavailable for examination, lost to history. Let me be absolutely clear about what this represents. This is obstruction of justice. This is destruction of evidence. In any normal investigation, in any case where the victim didn't have CIA connections, in any circumstances where powerful people weren't involved, the destruction of a victim's diary would be scandalous. It would be grounds for prosecution. It would be treated as a serious crime in its own right, because that diary might have been crucial to solving Mary's case. It might have contained names of people who'd threatened her, details of arguments she'd had, observations about people who made her uncomfortable, evidence of stalking or harassment, information about her relationship with Kennedy, yes, but also information about other relationships, other connections, other people who might have had motives to silence her. Alfred Hantman, the prosecutor who tried Ray Crump, later admitted he'd been totally unaware of who Mary Meyer was or what her connections were. He didn't know about her affair with Kennedy. He didn't know about her family background. He didn't know about her ex-husband's position at the CIA. He prosecuted the case as a simple crime, a woman taken during a robbery or assault on a public path. If he'd known the truth, he said, if he'd understood who Mary was and what she represented, it could have changed everything about how he approached the case. He would have investigated different angles, he would have asked different questions. He would have considered motives beyond random violence. Detective Bernie Crook, who worked the case, was even more direct when he learned decades later about the diary's destruction. I'd have been very upset at the time if I'd known that the deceased's diary had been destroyed, he said, because that diary was evidence. It belonged in the investigation. It should have been examined, analyzed, entered into the record. Its destruction, whether by Angleton or by Tony Bradley or by anyone else, was a criminal act that potentially prevented justice from being served. And Dovie Roundtree, the defense attorney who won Ray Crump's acquittal. She didn't learn about the diary's existence until decades later, long after the trial, long after Ray Crump had walked free. In her 2019 autobiography, Mighty Justice, she wrote about how differently she would have approached the case if she'd known. She wrote about the questions she would have asked, the lines of cross-examination she would have pursued, the reasonable doubt she could have created, by demonstrating that Mary Meyer's life and connections gave numerous people potential motives to silence her. How differently my line of cross-examination would have run, she wrote, had I been aware on July 20th, 1965, of the story Mr. Bradley told 30 years later in his autobiography. Had I been aware of it, I would have felt compelled to pursue it. I would have demanded access to that diary. I would have insisted it be entered into evidence. I would have used it to show the jury that there were other suspects, other possibilities, other explanations for what happened to Mary Meyer beyond the prosecution's simplistic theory that Ray Crump acted alone in a random act of violence. But she couldn't. Because the diary was gone, destroyed before the investigation even began, eliminated by people who believed they had the right to decide what evidence was relevant and what should be hidden. People who put institutional interests, political considerations, and personal loyalties above the search for truth. This isn't speculation. This isn't conspiracy theorizing. This is documented fact. The diary existed. Senior CIA officials knew about it immediately. They took steps to seize it. They destroyed it. And they never told investigators, never disclosed its existence to prosecutors or defense attorneys, never allowed it to be examined as evidence in a case where it might have been crucial to identifying the real perpetrator. Take a moment. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened to Mary Meyer. Tell me whether you believe in coincidences of this magnitude, whether you think it's possible that everything I've just described happened innocently, without coordination, without intention. Because I want to know whether I'm the only one who sees the pattern here, or whether you see it too. I want to know if you're asking the same questions I'm asking, and I want to know what you think we should do with cases like this, where powerful institutions clearly interfered with justice and got away with it. Now let's talk about the timing, because the timing matters. The timing might matter more than anything else in this entire story. Mary Pinchot Meyer was taken on October 12, 1964. The Warren Commission report was released on September 27, 1964. That's less than 3 weeks earlier. Less than 3 weeks between the official conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in taking President Kennedy and Mary Meyer's violent end on a Georgetown towpath. The Warren Commission report was supposed to settle the questions about Kennedy's passing. It was supposed to provide answers, closure, a definitive account of what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Chief Justice Warren and his fellow commissioners had spent 10 months investigating. They'd interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They'd examined thousands of documents. They'd studied the Zapruder film frame by frame. They'd conducted ballistics tests, medical examinations, trajectory analyses, and their conclusion was unequivocal. Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 1 shot missed entirely. 1 shot struck Kennedy in the back and exited through his throat, then struck Governor Connolly, causing multiple wounds, the so-called magic bullet that conspiracy theorists would spend decades questioning. And 1 shot struck Kennedy in the head, causing massive trauma and instant demise. Oswald acted alone. There was no conspiracy, no second gunman, no involvement by any organization, domestic or foreign. But many people didn't believe it. The Warren Commission report was immediately controversial. Critics pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony, to the improbability of the magic bullet theory, to Jack Ruby's convenient elimination of Oswald before he could be properly questioned. They questioned why so much evidence was classified, why witnesses who reported seeing shooters on the grassy knoll were ignored or dismissed, why the Commission seemed more interested in reaching a predetermined conclusion than in following the evidence wherever it led. Mary Meyer was among the skeptics. She told friends she was convinced the CIA had been involved in Kennedy's removal, not as wild speculation, not as paranoid conspiracy thinking, but as a conclusion based on what she knew, what she'd observed during her time with Kennedy, what she understood about the tensions between the president and the intelligence community. Kennedy had been at war with the CIA during his presidency, not openly, not in a way that made headlines, but in the quiet, dangerous way that power struggles happen at the highest levels of government. After the Bay of Pigs disaster in 1961, when a CIA-planned invasion of Cuba turned into a humiliating failure, Kennedy had been furious. He'd felt betrayed by the agency, misled about the chances of success, trapped into authorizing an operation that damaged American credibility and pushed Cuba further into the Soviet orbit. He'd told confidants he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. He'd forced Allen Dulles to resign as director. He'd consolidated power over covert operations, making it clear that no major actions could be taken without explicit presidential approval. The CIA had chafed under these restrictions. They'd viewed Kennedy as weak, as naive, as unwilling to do what was necessary to fight communism effectively. Mary knew all this. She'd been there for conversations about Vietnam, about Cuba, about the Cold War. She'd heard Kennedy express frustration with military leaders and intelligence officials who seemed to want escalation, who seemed to view peace as weakness. She'd understood, perhaps better than most, the pressures Kennedy was under, the forces pushing him toward confrontation when he wanted to move toward peace. After Kennedy's removal, after the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone, Mary started asking questions. She made phone calls to people who might have information. She talked to journalists, to researchers, to anyone who was investigating alternative theories. She didn't announce she was writing a book or planning to go public, but she was investigating. She was refusing to accept the official narrative. And then, less than 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report tried to close the book on Kennedy's case, Mary Pinchot Meyer was taken, shot twice at close range on a public path in Georgetown. Execution style, professional, efficient. Is that a coincidence? Is it possible that Mary's passing had nothing to do with her questions about Kennedy's removal, that the timing was purely random, that there's no connection between her investigation and her violent end? It's possible. Anything is possible. But you have to ask yourself, do you believe in coincidences of this magnitude? Now let's examine the conspiracy theory. Not to endorse it. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to lay out the facts, to show you the evidence, to let you draw your own conclusions. But we need to understand the theory, because understanding is what we do here at the Midnight File. We don't shy away from difficult questions. We don't dismiss possibilities just because they're uncomfortable or controversial. Peter Janney spent over 30 years researching Mary Meyer's passing. He's the son of Wistar Janney, who was a high-ranking CIA official during this period, a contemporary of James Angleton and Cord Meyer, someone who moved in the same circles and understood how the agency operated. Peter grew up in this world, around these people, absorbing the culture of secrecy and deception that defined Cold War intelligence work. In his 2012 book, Mary's Mosaic, The CIA Conspiracy to End John F. Kennedy, Mary Pinchot Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace, Peter makes a detailed, circumstantial case that the CIA orchestrated Mary's elimination. His central thesis is that Mary had pieced together evidence that the CIA was responsible for Kennedy's removal, that she intended to go public with this information, and that she was therefore eliminated as part of a cover-up. Janney argues that several facts support this theory. First, the CIA had foreknowledge of Mary's passing before police even identified her body. This suggests surveillance, inside information, coordination between the agency and someone at the scene. How else do you explain Cord Meyer receiving that phone call at 2:30 in the afternoon? Second, the CIA's counterintelligence chief was caught attempting to break into her home searching for her diary. This wasn't a junior officer acting on his own initiative. This was James Angleton, one of the most senior officials in American intelligence, personally conducting a black bag operation to seize private documents. That level of personal involvement suggests the diary contained something explosive, something that couldn't be trusted to subordinates. Third, the official account of what happened to Mary's diary appears to contain significant falsehoods and inconsistencies. Ben Bradley says he gave it to Angleton. Angleton says he destroyed it. Tony Bradley later says she destroyed it herself. These stories can't all be true. Someone is lying about what happened to crucial evidence. And when powerful people lie about evidence in a case, it raises the question, what are they hiding? Fourth, Mary had recently begun asking pointed questions about the Kennedy removal and made no secret of her suspicions. She wasn't being quiet about her doubts regarding the Warren Commission. She was actively investigating, talking to people, gathering information. In the intelligence world, someone asking questions like that is called a security risk, someone who might know too much and is unwilling to stay silent. Fifth, the execution-style nature of the ending, 2 shots at close range, fired by someone highly trained, suggests a professional hit rather than random street violence. The medical examiner noted the precision of the shots, the dark halos indicating point-blank range, the instant lethality. This wasn't someone panicking or acting impulsively. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And sixth, Mary was taken shortly after publicly expressing outrage at the Warren Commission report. The timing, Janney argues, was not coincidental. She was eliminated before she could become a larger problem, before she could use her connections and credibility to cast doubt on the official narrative. Janney goes further. He makes claims that are difficult to verify but impossible to completely dismiss. He says his own father, Wistar Janney, had foreknowledge of Mary's passing, that Wistar was part of the team that orchestrated it, that planned the operation, that selected the operator, that coordinated the cover-up, and that this knowledge haunted Wistar for the rest of his life, creating a burden he could never fully confess but could never escape. Peter describes his research as a kind of Greek tragedy, the sins of the father being visited on the son. He says his father dropped hints over the years, made cryptic comments that only made sense in retrospect, carried a guilt that manifested in depression and drinking and withdrawal. Wistar Janney passed away before Peter began his serious research into Mary's case, so we can't verify these claims. We can't ask Wistar whether his son's interpretation is accurate or whether Peter is reading meaning into coincidence and projection. But Peter believes it. He spent 3 decades researching, interviewing witnesses, tracking down documents, piecing together a narrative that explains not just Mary's passing, but the entire context of why she had to be silenced. He believes the CIA removed Kennedy because he was moving toward peace, because he was threatening the institutional interests of the military-industrial complex, because he represented a threat to the Cold War consensus that kept defense budgets high and covert operations flowing. And he believes they removed Mary because she understood this, because she was asking the right questions, because she represented a loose end that had to be tied up. Is he right? I don't know. I truly don't know. But here's what we do know for certain, what no one disputes, what the historical record clearly establishes. Mary Pinchot Meyer was intimately connected to both President Kennedy and the CIA. She was taken less than 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report concluded that no conspiracy existed in Kennedy's removal. The CIA learned of her passing before police identified her body. The CIA's counterintelligence chief broke into her studio the same day looking for her personal writings. Her diary, potentially crucial evidence, was destroyed before investigators knew it existed. The man arrested for her ending was acquitted due to complete lack of forensic evidence. And the case has never been solved. Those are facts. Everything beyond that is interpretation, speculation, theory building. But those facts taken together paint a picture that's deeply troubling regardless of whether you believe in CIA involvement. Not all researchers accept the conspiracy theory. It's important to note that. Nina Burleigh, who wrote the 1999 biography A Very Private Woman, spent years researching Mary's life and came to different conclusions than Peter Janney. Burleigh rejects the CIA hit hypothesis. She came to believe that Ray Crump Jr. was most probably responsible for Mary's end, despite the acquittal and despite the lack of forensic evidence. Burleigh points to Crump's post-trial criminal history as evidence of his capacity for violence. Roundtree, however, believed the trauma of spending 8 months in jail awaiting trial for something he didn't do fundamentally changed him. She'd seen how the machinery of justice, even when it ultimately acquits, can destroy a person's sense of self. So where does that leave us? With questions. Always questions. Who actually fired those 2 shots on the towpath? Was it Ray Crump Jr.? Despite everything that suggests otherwise, despite the physical description mismatch, despite the absence of forensic evidence, despite the missing weapon, was it a professional operative, carrying out orders from above, executing a target who knew too much? Was it someone else entirely? Someone we've never considered because the investigation focused so narrowly on Crump and then stopped when he was acquitted. What was truly in Mary's diary? Just details of her affair with Kennedy, intimate moments, personal reflections, the kind of private thoughts any person might record about a relationship. Or was it something more? Observations about CIA operations she'd learned about through Cord, conversations she'd had with Kennedy about the agency's activities, evidence that would have implicated powerful people in activities they couldn't afford to have exposed. Was it information about Kennedy's removal, details that contradicted the Warren Commission's findings, names of people who might have been involved? Did Mary actually have evidence about Kennedy's end, Or was she simply asking the same questions that millions of Americans were asking, questions born from grief and disbelief rather than from insider knowledge? Was her investigation based on concrete information or on intuition and suspicion? Why did Cord Meyer receive that phone call at 2:30 in the afternoon? Who made that call? How did they know Mary was gone before her body had even been formally identified? What channels of communication were operating outside official police procedures? And why would anyone's first instinct be to notify the CIA rather than Mary's family? What happened during the confrontation? Some witnesses reported between Mary and Cord before her end. Some accounts suggest Mary threatened to go public with information about the CIA, that she'd warned Cord she was done staying silent, that she was going to expose what she knew about Kennedy's removal regardless of the consequences. Did that happen? And if it did, who else knew about it? Who else heard about this threat and decided it needed to be neutralized? Would the trial have been different if the diary's significance had been disclosed to the defense? Would Dovey Roundtree have been able to introduce evidence of alternative suspects, of motives beyond random violence, of connections that suggested this was more than a street crime gone wrong? Would the jury have reached a different verdict if they'd known who Mary really was and what she represented? And finally, perhaps most troubling, could there have been a second person at the scene that day? Some witnesses reported seeing another individual in the area, someone who didn't match Ray Crump's description. Did police focus so intensely on Crump that they ignored evidence pointing to someone else? Was there another person who fired those shots while Crump was nearby, innocent and unaware that he was about to become the primary suspect in a case that would destroy his life? We'll never know, not with certainty. The physical evidence is long gone, contaminated by time and mishandling and the passage of 6 decades. The key witness, the diary itself, was deliberately destroyed by people who believed they had the right to decide what evidence was relevant. The people who might have provided answers, James Angleton, Cord Meyer, Wistar Janney, Ben Bradley, have all passed away, taking their knowledge to the grave. And the statute of limitations for obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence expired decades ago. No one will ever be prosecuted for what happened to that diary, for the interference in the investigation, for the systematic suppression of information that might have led to justice. Mary Pinchot Meyer walked onto a towpath in Georgetown on an October afternoon in 1964. The leaves were turning golden red. The water was calm. The air was crisp and clean. She was alone with her thoughts, walking a path she'd walked hundreds of times before, in a neighborhood where she should have been safe. And somewhere between the canal and the trees, between her studio and home, between one moment and the next, her life ended. 2 shots. Close range. Professional precision. And 60 years later, we still don't know why. Not really, not for certain. Was she simply unlucky? A woman in the wrong place at the wrong time, the victim of random violence in a city that saw more than its share of such tragedies. Washington in 1964 was not the gentrified tourist destination it is today. Parts of the city were dangerous. Crime rates were high. People were assaulted and robbed and worse every day. Was she targeted because of her relationship with Kennedy, eliminated to protect a reputation or prevent revelations that might tarnish Camelot's already fading legacy? The Kennedy family had tremendous resources and influence. They'd worked hard to craft a particular narrative about the president after his removal, to emphasize his strengths and minimize his weaknesses. Mary's diary, with its detailed account of their affair, represented a threat to that carefully constructed image. Or was she taken because she knew too much, because she'd pieced together a truth that powerful institutions needed to keep hidden, because she represented a threat to the official narrative about Kennedy's removal that was being so carefully constructed and defended, because she was asking questions that shouldn't be asked, investigating matters that should have stayed buried, refusing to accept the lies she was being told? I can't answer that. Nobody can. Not with absolute certainty. But I can tell you this. The deliberate destruction of her diary, the CIA's immediate knowledge of her passing, the forensic absence of evidence against the man who was prosecuted, the timing in relation to the Warren Commission report. These facts suggest that whatever happened on that towpath, it wasn't the simple crime that authorities wanted us to believe it was. Mary Pinchot Meyer deserved better. She deserved an honest investigation, evidence preserved instead of destroyed, a search for truth instead of a rush to convenient conclusions. She deserved to have her story told completely, without omissions or cover-ups or institutional interference. She deserved justice, the kind of justice that comes from thorough investigation and accountability, and a legal system that values truth over expediency. Instead, she got a case file that raises more questions than it answers. She got a diary that vanished before it could speak for her. She got a system that protected the powerful while prosecuting the powerless. She got investigators who were kept in the dark about who she really was and what her connections meant. She got a trial where crucial evidence was hidden from both prosecution and defense. She got a verdict of not guilty for the wrong reasons, not because the jury carefully weighed evidence and found reasonable doubt, but because the prosecution's case was so weak that acquittal was inevitable. And she got silence. Decades of silence, broken only by researchers like Peter Janney and Nina Burley, by journalists who've tried to piece together what really happened, by people like you, people who refuse to accept that some questions shouldn't be asked, that some doors shouldn't be opened, that some files should remain closed forever. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself questioning the official narratives, wondering about the gaps in our understanding of power and truth, if you're lying awake tonight thinking about what really happened on that towpath, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to a friend who loves mysteries. Post it where people gather to discuss the cases that history forgot. Because stories like Mary's only survive if we keep telling them. They only matter if we refuse to let them be forgotten. They only have power if we continue asking the questions that powerful people hoped would fade away. Every town keeps a secret. Every institution protects its own. Every power structure, when threatened, closes ranks and defends itself regardless of truth or justice. And sometimes, the truth walks onto a towpath on an autumn afternoon and simply disappears, leaving behind only questions and shadows and the faint echo of two shots that changed nothing and everything. Mary Pinchot Meyer was 43 years old when she was taken from this world. She was an accomplished artist, a free thinker, a woman who refused to be defined by her relationships to powerful men. She loved deeply, questioned fearlessly, and refused to accept comfortable lies. She deserves to be remembered not just as Kennedy's mistress or Cord Meyer's ex-wife or another victim of unsolved violence, but as someone who mattered in her own right, who made contributions to art and culture, who challenged power and demanded truth. Her case remains officially unsolved, but really it's worse than unsolved. It's a case where evidence was destroyed, where investigators were misled, where powerful institutions interfered to protect their interests, where justice was never really possible because the deck was stacked from the beginning. It's a reminder that in America, despite all our ideals about equal justice under law, power still matters, connections still matter, and sometimes the people who should be protecting us are the ones we most need protection from. Think about what we know for certain. A woman with intimate knowledge of both the president and the CIA was taken execution-style on a public path. The CIA learned of her passing before police identified her body. The head of CIA counterintelligence personally broke into her studio to seize her personal writings. Those writings were destroyed before any investigator could examine them. The only suspect was prosecuted despite having no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. He was acquitted, and no one else has ever been seriously investigated. If this had happened to someone without Mary's connections, would we still be talking about it 60 years later? Probably not. It would be just another cold case, another unsolved ending, another file gathering dust in an archive somewhere. But because of who Mary was, because of the questions her passing raises, because of the systematic suppression of evidence and the CIA's involvement, this case has become something more. It's become a symbol of how power operates in the shadows, how institutions protect themselves, how truth can be buried when it threatens the wrong people. I started this episode by asking you to subscribe if stories like this keep you awake at night, because the Midnight File exists to tell stories that powerful people hoped would be forgotten. We shine light into corners that were meant to stay dark. We ask questions that were supposed to remain unasked. Mary Pinchot Meyer walked into history on October 12, 1964, and she never walked back out. Her story is one of power and art, love and betrayal, questions and silence. Was she taken because of what she knew? Was she silenced because of what she might say? Or was she simply, tragically, in the wrong place at the wrong time, the victim of random violence that had nothing to do with presidents or intelligence agencies or conspiracies? I don't have the answer, no one does, but I know this. Her diary was destroyed for a reason. The CIA broke into her studio for a reason. Evidence was suppressed for a reason. And those reasons, whatever they were, had nothing to do with finding justice for Mary Pinchot Meyer. She deserved better. She deserved an investigation that followed the evidence wherever it led. She deserved prosecutors who knew the full truth about who she was. She deserved a legal system that valued truth over institutional convenience. She deserved to have her story told honestly, completely, without powerful people deciding which parts were too dangerous to reveal. Instead, she got a cover-up. Maybe not a cover-up of a conspiracy to end her life. Maybe that's too far, maybe that's connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But certainly a cover-up of who she was, what she knew and why that might have mattered. A cover-up that ensured we would never know the full truth about what happened on that towpath in Georgetown on an October afternoon when the leaves were turning and the water was calm and a woman went for a walk and never came home. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. And Washington, D.C., that city built on secrets, that place where power concentrates and corrupts, where the machinery of government grinds on regardless of individual lives. Washington buried Mary Pinchot Meyer's story as deeply as any secret it's ever kept. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some questions refuse to stay silent. Some files, once opened, can never truly be closed again. This has been the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross. And Mary Pinchot Meyer's story, like so many stories we examine here, reminds us that the most haunting mysteries are the ones where we know just enough to understand that we don't know anything at all, where the official story has just enough holes to let doubt creep in, where the evidence points in directions that powerful people didn't want anyone to look. The next file is waiting. It's already sitting on my desk, full of photographs and documents and witness statements and unanswered questions. And it might be darker still, because history is full of stories like Mary's, stories of people who knew too much, asked too many questions, threatened the wrong interests. Stories that got buried under official narratives and institutional power and the simple passage of time. But we remember. We ask questions. We refuse to let these stories disappear into the silence that powerful people hoped would swallow them forever. If you're still with me, if you've stayed for this entire journey through Mary Pinchot Meyer's life and passing, and the decades of questions that followed, then you understand why this matters. You understand why we can't let cases like this be forgotten. You understand why every cover-up, every destroyed piece of evidence, every institutional interference in the search for truth, all of it matters. All of it echoes forward through time. All of it shapes the kind of society we live in. Mary walked alone on an autumn afternoon. She was 43 years old, accomplished, intelligent, unafraid. She'd loved a president. She'd questioned an agency. She'd refused to accept comfortable lies. And somewhere between the canal and the trees, her story ended. But the questions she left behind, those questions are still alive, still unanswered, still haunting everyone who takes the time to really look at what happened and what was hidden and why. Share this story. Talk about it. Question it. Investigate it yourself if you feel called to do so. Because the only way these stories survive, the only way truth has any chance against power, is if enough people care enough to keep asking, keep digging, keep refusing to accept that some questions are too dangerous to pursue. The file is closed. But the case has never been solved. And maybe, just maybe, it never will be. Because some secrets are buried too deep, some power structures are too strong, some truths are too dangerous for institutional power to allow them to see daylight. But we tried. We looked. We asked. And that matters. That will always matter. This has been the Midnight File. Until the next case, until the next mystery, until the next story that refuses to stay buried. Remember Mary Pinchot Meyer. Remember what happened to her. Remember the questions that were never answered and the evidence that was never examined. Remember that power, when threatened, protects itself first and asks questions about justice later. She walked into the woods, and the world simply forgot her. But we haven't, and we won't, because some stories are too important to forget, no matter how deeply powerful people try to bury them. The midnight hour has passed, but the questions remain, and they always will.